Oh no, Skeletor's surrounding us with all of his men. What are we gonna do? Don't worry, He-Man. I've got this. Today we're going to take a deep dive into the character of Fisto. Fisto shows up briefly in the trailer for the new 2026 live action Masters of the Universe movie, and all the fans are wondering what sort of storylines are going to go along with our big fisted hero. So, to catch us up to speed, I was going to go over all the different versions and narratives that have gone with our hero ever since the 80s. When Fisto first came out, he was sort of part of a line of like large, right handed, big fisted heroes and villains. And in the early commercial, he was pitted against Clawful. And Clawful had this like really big right hand crab claw with this like pinch action. And so I guess they had like the two big right handed characters to battle off against one another. Although that kind of quickly moved aside to another arch rival, Jitsu. So I've got my Fisto and Jitsu from the re-releases here in their packages. Now, in the 80s, those toys had gimmicky features like in the big gym line where you could pull them back and Fisto would give like big fisting action and Jitsu would karate chop. But in the new re-releases, it's more about posability than those gimmicky actions. And my vintage one that does have that action was kind of falling apart. So I made some art out of it. And I put him into this shadow box with my other 80s friends. But to play with, I like to use my Mr. T version of it when they did the WWE crossover. And Mr. T has the Jitsu hand and the Fisto fist. And plus, he's Mr. T. Who doesn't love Mr. T? So the imagery of like the two metallic handed hero and villain against each other seemed like an obvious match for being arch villains. And then Mattel even released these like steeds for them to ride. So there was Night Stalker, the evil horse, and Stridor, the heroic horse. And they were like half horses, half robots. And there was some sort of like ambiguity as to whether or not they like had self-awareness, had souls essentially. And there was one 80s episode where Stridor basically developed a soul, and it was very sort of beautiful and poetic. So also I've got to play with my Masterverse version of Fisto, and he's outrageous with all kinds of wild fist attachments for him to have as he battles the bad guys. So beyond the commercials and the imagery that sort of set the stage for who would be an arch rival of whom, there was never really actually a narrative or really stories that kind of fleshed that out. And in fact, the first big narrative of Fisto in the 80s cartoon in the Filmation era, Fisto's Forest, we learned that Fisto used to be a bad guy. And he had been sort of like working with Skeletor, and there was like enchanted magic involved. And Fisto lived in this forest and was like terrorizing the villagers of the forest. And then there was like he was sort of like a logger, which would kind of explain sort of like the woodsman look that he had. And in long story short, he learned his ways. He-Man helped him to learn his ways, and also with the help of like a little girl. I'm going to use my Adora as like the little girl stand-in. Raina, I think was her name in the cartoon, and like a little girl and He-Man helped Fisto to learn his ways and become a good guy. Again, very interesting that Filmation in the 80s had so many roles for women and young girls. And so no wonder why it became like very, very popular. I think that the stats were like 40% of the purchasers of motu in the 80s were little girls because it really appealed to their sensibilities. Fisto's got you now, He-Man. You know, Fisto, maybe you shouldn't be such a jerk. Maybe you shouldn't be so mean. You're right, little girl. Hey, Skeletor, get the hook. So then later in the 2000X or like Mike Young era of the Masters of the Universe, Fisto got this huge story arc. And for starters, he was the brother of Duncan, the brother of Man-at-Arms. And he had been like a war deserter. He had like abandoned his platoon during a battle in a war called the Great Unrest. And then he was like living on the outskirts of society in shame. And I think there was even like some alcoholism involved. And so it really kind of tapped into like the traumas that vets suffer and post-traumatic stress disorder and platoon abandonment issues, like very, very layered stuff for this cartoon, which is why that Mike Young era was one of my favorites in terms of storytelling. So in that narrative, while he had like abandoned his platoon, in his version of the story is that like he had blacked out and there was like some memory loss and he didn't really know where he was. And so the other part of the story is that when he was in this sort of blacked out phase, that he had a relationship with the sorceress, and they had fallen in love and had a child. And so there was like hints and allegations that Teela was the actual biological daughter of Fisto. Now, and then that would make her adopted father her uncle. So very interesting storytelling. It never really went anywhere. The cartoon got canceled. All of this was sort of like hinted at in the cartoon. The character that was like Teela's father was like had bandages all over his face and his giant fists. So like we weren't really sure who he was, and it was never really resolved. It's a shame because it was a great series. I would have loved to have had a resolution. Also, they were kind of getting ready to have Fisto be an arch enemy to the Snake Men. And I do have my 2000X Fisto, who's also falling apart. And maybe I will make some art out of them as well someday. So the question is, what sort of story arcs are they going to have with the new movie coming out? So with Idris Elba playing Duncan, that would make them being brothers complicated. I mean, not impossible, but they would sort of have to address that, the elephant in the room in some way. Or maybe they're just going to avoid it altogether. Again, canon in Masters of the Universe is a little bit loose at best. It all comes down to which era, which comics, which cartoons, and even just like what stories did you have when you were a little kid to make up as you played with the great toys. So thanks again for watching, and join us next time where we'll take another deep dive into another character featured in the exciting new trailer for Masters of the Universe. Subscribe, or else.